Well, joining us now is our weekly journalist panel. Robert Fife is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, Tonda MacCharles, the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, and Robert Russo, the former Bureau Chief for both the Canadian Press and the CBC. Hello to the three of you.
Hello, Michael.
So obviously we're going to begin with India here because, U.S. prosecutors say that the intended target in the U.S. was on the same target list as Sikh McCharles. So I wonder, with that revelation, how does that change or further our understanding of what happened here in Canada? Tonda?
I mean, there are a lot more details in that indictment, obviously. We've learned that there were more targets of this plot. We've learned, to me, it's very interesting, the window on what happened here, the detail that we got out of the indictment versus what we got in Canada, which was a blanket statement that there were some allegations. But it's pretty clear now it's because there was an informant, a source inside the plot in the U.S. that could reveal these details, and enough so that they can take it to court. What does that mean for an investigation ending up in any kind of charges here in Canada? That's pretty unclear to me. But it was a fascinating glimpse inside what prompted the Prime Minister to go public in September.
I'll get to that in a second. But Rob, your reaction first.
Sure. It makes it look like it was an exponentially wider plot, multiple targets, transnational in nature as well. And it makes India look more like one of those authoritarian regimes that wants to eliminate its opponents off its own shores. And there aren't many countries that do that. Russia is one of those countries. Vladimir Putin's Russia is one of those. And it begs the question, how close do democracies want to get to a country that is prepared to execute its opponents overseas on their own shores?
Bob?
Well, look, I mean, for me, it's the Americans were successful in uncovering this, arresting the person. Canada was aware of this. We've got nobody arrested. We didn't even manage to protect the life of Hardeep Singh Najjar, who was assassinated by a masked gunman. We know that 3 other Canadians were also on the hit list. Fortunately, they were not killed by this, but you compare almost everything, whether it was the Chinese police stations where the FBI makes arrests, we put a police car outside these fake Chinese police stations, no arrest, and now we have a Canadian who was assassinated and still no arrest, and the RCMP have not been able to say at all where they are in terms of this investigation. But we all know the longer it is, the less likely there's going to be arrest.
Yeah, well, without a doubt, it's very extraordinary that this has happened even in the first place. But it's also jarring, though, because it's India, right? Like, if you look at this country's Indo-Pacific strategy, India plays a big part of it. And in fact, when you go through that strategy, India is named as a partner in defending the values Canadians hold dear, and yet this happens. So do we need to rethink that partnership? Do we need to rethink India, at least while Modi is in power?
It seems to me that that is a broader discussion for many countries in the world, including the U.S., because, look, India's been the belle of the ball ever since China was aggressively around the world, acting in a way that pretty clearly signaled its authoritarian character and coercing other countries and leveraging its economic weight. Many countries around the world, India, or rather Canada and the U.S., saw India as the counterweight to that, right? The bully in the region, the democracy, the world's largest democracy. We could all embrace it because it was a democracy and a growing economy. But I don't think that even as bad as all this is enough to suddenly change the foreign policy of countries like Canada and the US and the UK and Germany, EU. Everybody wants to do business in India right now, and I don't see this as fundamentally changing that calculation. They will still, and we've heard it already, those governments all say they want to engage with India. I mean, Joe Biden and his Secretary of State have had these same conversations that Trudeau and his people had with the India officials. The only reason perhaps they got a better hearing is because of the economic partnership there and the economic weight that each carries. So yes, maybe we do have to rethink it a bit, but I don't see that fundamentally the desire to engage India will change.
Rob?
You know, it's interesting. This happened a month before Prime Minister Modi was welcomed to the White House in Washington, where there was a glittering ball. Celebrities were invited. President Biden showed no traces whatsoever of this being in any way a hiccup. It is clear that this is one of those equations. You know, Henry Kissinger just died a couple of days ago. He used to talk about values versus interests. And this is one of those times when countries are going to decide whether or not they want to do business with a country that shares its values, or whether it's in their interest to have a relationship with a country like India. Right now, it looks like the United States, taking a look at India's growth, I think it was 7.6% GDP growth last quarter. They believe it's probably in their interests to continue to nurture the relationship with India while trying to draw red lines around what India can do, but not necessarily share values with India.
Bob?
Well, first of all, India under Modi is drifting towards authoritarianism, and that's something that everybody should be concerned about. But
Noted by human rights groups around the world.
Absolutely, but real politics is real politics here. India is the world's largest, has the largest population. It's a fast-growing economy, and more significant, it is the most important counterweight to China, the world's second biggest economy and the world's second biggest military. The United States needs India, and so does Vietnam, so does the Philippines. All of those countries in the region are very, very concerned about China, particularly the way they've been operating in the South China Seas, but they've been extending their reach in these shipping trade zones, and there is no way in the world that we're going to have a rupture in Indian relations with Western countries because of that.
And don't forget, look, all of this was known to the governments, at least at the highest levels of government, before all the G20 leaders went to India in September and had meetings with Modi, and yet it was only after that that Canada came forward with its allegations, but again, with very little detail. And yet, you know, Biden at that G20, we heard nothing of, you know, Biden's concerns around the plot that was unfolding in the U.S. when he was in India. It was all behind closed doors. Why? Because nobody wants to embarrass the Indian government on that stage right now. It's not worth it to them.
Well, that leads me to my other question, because you were talking about the Prime Minister standing in the House of Commons, and it's really a marked difference from how we learned about the American allegations, right? It had to be filed as an indictment. Once the indictment was released, then the details came out of the investigation.
I mean, well, there's a reason why the Prime Minister came out earlier than everybody else, is that, you know, we were going to publish the story. And he just wanted to, he didn't want it to be in a newspaper, so he got out ahead of the newspaper story. I'm sure that he would have preferred to wait until these indictments were unsealed before he came out and spoke about the issue. But so I don't think it wasn't an issue that he was trying to rush out and embarrass Modi. It was just that, you know, the media got ahead of them.
Yeah, the details were out there. But does this mean that we need to think about how we as a country start approaching India then? Because if this is happening at the same time, how do you address these issues while still pursuing something like the Indo-Pacific strategy?
Well, we've already started to reconsider how we deal with them, haven't we, as a fallout of this? I mean, yes, some visas that were previously suspended now are being issued again by the Indian government, but this has caused a huge diplomatic rupture. Canada withdrew 41 of its diplomats, 2/3 of its diplomatic contingent in that country. It's going to affect, and it has affected, you know, the ties between the two. And, you know, it's fine for the Trudeau government to say, well, there are people-to-people ties and business connections, long-standing business and people-to-people ties that will carry through. But a lot of that depends on services provided by diplomats on the ground in the country. And, you know, sure, they've renewed giving some visas, but I think that we're already seeing the impacts of this relationship and suffering as a result. Where does it go from there? I'm not sure. But like I said, in the bigger picture, I don't see this government also abandoning engagement with India over it.
Okay. Quickly losing time, and before we're done, I do also want to bring up another story, of course, happened earlier in the week, the invocation of Alberta's Sovereignty Act over the clean electricity regulations. Is this something to be concerned about? Rob, I'll begin with you.
Well, I think it's something to be concerned about in that it looks like it's another sort of opening on the national unity front. All of us kind of came of age covering national unity in Canada when there was a threat coming from Quebec. But you look at what's happening in Alberta and what's happening in Saskatchewan, and there's more and more open defiance, it looks like, of the federal government. Now, is it going to actually amount to anything? You listen to Minister Wilkinson, and he says, I think he told CP yesterday or the day before, that he is prepared to be flexible on when some of these regulations come in. Some of them are not going to come in until 2044. You know, I'm fond of saying I'm very popular at Christmas parties with my family because I have the magic quarter trick. I pretend to take a quarter, put it in a mayonnaise jar, put it under a porch, and next thing you know, it's teleported. Well, you know, resolutions like this are very much the same way. The Premier can make a resolution, pass a resolution, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's the courts that will ultimately decide if it actually gets there. I think there's lots of room for negotiation and discussion before anything like that happens.
Well, the unity is going to be even more fractured because we are expecting the federal government to unveil a new cap on oil and gas emissions on the industry, and you know, we know that Alberta and Saskatchewan are loaded for bear on this one, and this is probably going to end up in the courts as well. And you know, the problem that this government has is that they're bleeding 1,000 cuts on the carbon tax, that they made that ridiculous move to satisfy Atlantic Canada. Now you've got Indigenous people saying, well, what about us? We've got everybody else in the rest of the country saying this, and then you have Alberta and Saskatchewan saying we're being mistreated here. So I think the country is going to face increased national unity problems, not from Quebec now, but from Western Canada, and it's concerning.
Tonda?
I take a little bit more sanguine view than that on it. I think that federalism is a system fraught with some of these challenges, and you know, when there are conflicting priorities, especially in areas where there are overlapping jurisdictions like environment. So I think the country is working its way through some of those conflicts and challenges. I don't think everything would be magically resolved by a change in government at either level, because like Bob said, you know, things like the oil and gas cap, those are going to be ongoing challenges for any government and any stripe of political government that comes into play. Because as far as I know, I don't know of any major political party that's actually said ditch climate change policies altogether and we won't fight climate change. It's about how do you get to the action to address climate change. And so I see that federalism has built in it a bit of these conflicts. And yes, a lot of it relies on the good faith interactions by all these players. And right now, I think there's some antagonisms that are going on, but you know, to a certain extent, 'twas ever thus. And you know, if Pierre Poilievre becomes prime minister, which the polls suggest he might, you know, he opposes Danielle Smith on the pension plan changes that she wants to make. He will find himself clashing with provinces over various things, right? There were two conservative leaders, Danny Williams in Newfoundland and Stephen Harper in Ottawa, that clashed mightily over regulation of how you do offshore oil benefits and stuff. So I see that some of the conflict is built into the system, but the system has functioned and can still function, I think, as long as players like premiers actually follow sort of the way disputes get regulated. And that's through the courts, not through arbitrary acts of deciding, I'm going to decide what's unconstitutional and not the courts. Those are the things that raise the conflict.
Well, except that is exactly what the Alberta Act does, right?
But she dialed back some of even in this week's motion, she dialed back the whole notion that I'm going to declare unconstitutional. She said she's not going to force anyone to do something that's not legally permissible. So already some of that rhetoric is changing. And then on Tuesday or Wednesday, she was out hugging Chrystia Freeland and Randy Boissonneau after they announced the Dow chemical plant. So
and next week,
take a breath. Everybody take a breath.
Minister Guilbeault and Danielle Smith are going to be at COP together, and she's on an invitation list to dinner. Yeah. I'm sure she's going to be bringing a stack of some of those clippings that she was talking about, saying that Minister Guilbeault hadn't read. But that would be entertainment value if they throw open the doors and let us scribblers and lens people have a listen.
Who's going to take a bet on that one? But listen, out of time. Thank you for that. We'll convene. We've got 2 more weeks of the sitting parliament before the year's done. So for now, Tonda, Rob, Bob, thank you for the time.
Have a good weekend.
You too.
Sure.